All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive shift in how we view the world, the public-private dichotomy, and how feminist political thought completely shattered it. We're not just talking about dusty, abstract theory here. We're talking about the everyday realities of power, freedom, and equality that literally dictate how we organize our lives right now. To kick things off, ask yourself this. Where exactly does your private life end, and where does politics begin? Seriously, think about the decisions you make in your own home, or even how you divide household chores. Are those things political? Well, for a very, very long time, the answer from mainstream political science was a resounding no. But, as we're going to see, that answer got fiercely contested. So here's the setup. For centuries, classical political theory built this massive, rigid wall between the public and the private spheres. And this wasn't just some minor philosophical footnote. It was the very foundation of how society was built. The core assumption was basically this. To understand power and politics, you only need to look at one side of that wall, and you completely ignore the other. Historically, real politics belonged entirely to the public sphere. We're talking government, law, collective citizenship. Meanwhile, the private sphere was strictly domestic, family, marriage, personal choices. For liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill, this private sphere was a sacred sanctuary. It was viewed as a quiet retreat of pure individual liberty where the state had absolutely no business interfering. And this divide? It was championed by history's heavy hitters. You have Aristotle separating the political life of the polis from the oikos, or household. Locke and Rousseau building theories to protect private property and traditional gender roles from state reach. Even Hegel mapped out a complex system, keeping family affection completely separate from state politics. The consensus was crystal clear. The home was simply not a place for politics. But then came the disruption. Feminist political theory looked at this centuries-old setup and asked a really uncomfortable but necessary question. Why are activities traditionally associated with women conveniently labeled private and kept out of the political arena? They argued that treating the private sphere as some untouchable sanctuary didn't actually protect freedom. Actually, it concealed deep, systemic inequalities. This whole disruption is perfectly captured in one explosive phrase. The personal is political. It's a total game changer. It blew up the assumption that what happens in the home happens in a vacuum. Instead, it revealed that our most intimate, personal experiences are profoundly shaped by wider political and economic power structures. To really grasp this, we have to look at patriarchy, and not just as some abstract buzzword, but as a breathing social structure where men have historically held greater power and privilege. Patriarchy doesn't just operate through formal laws. It works through marriage customs, property relations, and subtle cultural norms. That traditional public-private wall was an active tool reinforcing this by confining women to domestic duties. When you finally shatter that wall, you start to see how private issues have massive systemic implications. Take domestic violence. It happens behind closed doors, but it is fundamentally an issue of justice and human rights. Or unpaid domestic labor. It heavily dictates economic dependence and who gets to build wealth. These aren't just private family matters. They're the literal gears of systemic injustice. As this disruption grew, the feminist critique evolved into a highly organized framework with many different analytical lenses. Because, women aren't a monolith, and inequality has a lot of different roots. So the ways thinkers approach dismantling this divide naturally branched out. Different branches target different structures. Liberal feminism zeroes in on securing equal rights and legal reforms within that public sphere. Radical feminism argues the call is coming from inside the house, that unequal power is rooted right there in personal relationships and the family. And Marxist and socialist feminisms, they shift the lens to capitalism, showing how women's unpaid domestic labor essentially subsidizes the entire global economy. Among these diverse perspectives, Simone de Beauvoir dropped this heavy-hitting statement: one is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. She argued that gender roles are significantly shaped by socialization, not just pure biology. Society actively constructs a woman's identity. This was a massive blow to the old idea that the domestic sphere was just a natural biological default. Then we have intersectionality, an incredibly powerful concept coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw. Think of inequality like traffic flowing from different directions: gender, class, race. An accident at the intersection involves all of them. Crenshaw's work ensures we get that a woman's experience of the public-private divide changes entirely depending on her race or class. There's no single identical experience. The layers always overlap. And this theoretical toolkit had to expand globally, right? Cultural feminism asks us to reevaluate why society devalues private traits like care and empathy. Postmodern feminism dives into the social construction of gender and language. Ecofeminism draws fascinating parallels between environmental exploitation and gender oppression. And post-colonial feminism focuses on the global interaction of gender, colonialism, and nationalism. It proves how deep these power structures truly go. So, what's the real-world impact of completely dismantling this old wall? It forces a total rethink of democracy and human rights. We stop just looking at formal institutions like courts and parliaments, and we start studying the mechanics of power in everyday life. Influential thinkers brought this all to light. Carol Patterman revealed the unequal relations hidden in social contract theory. Susan Muller-Oken argued that traditional family structures just reproduce gender inequality for the next generation. Catherine McKinnon challenged the law by exposing the power dynamics in sexuality. And bell hooks emphasized feminism through multiple overlapping forms of inequality. They proved you can't have a just society if the home itself is unjust. Which brings us to a really complex theoretical debate. Can the state actually be an instrument of true emancipation, or does it inherently reproduce existing power structures? Some argue we absolutely need the state to enforce equality and protect the vulnerable. But others strongly caution that state institutions were built on those old, biased foundations, so they might just enforce the very systems of control we're trying to dismantle. Ultimately, all of this leads us to our modern reality, where that once rigid boundary between public and private is incredibly fluid. We don't live in Aristotle's world of the separate polis and oikos anymore. Today, we recognize that while these spheres might be distinct in theory, in practice, they are deeply, unbreakably interconnected. Just think about it. Social media makes our most personal experiences totally public. Digital tech is driving massive questions about data privacy and surveillance. And private family experiences like reproductive rights and childcare are literally the center of public policy debates. The personal isn't just political today. It is highly visibly public. So the modern goal is finding the sweet spot. It's about balancing personal privacy with state protection and individual autonomy with social justice. Because here's the catch. If the state controls all private life, we lose individual liberty. But if private life is completely untouchable by politics, deep systemic abuses just hide safely in the shadows. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. As our daily habits, our families, and our digital footprints constantly intersect with public policy and systemic power, finding where the individual ends and the state begins is more complex than ever. So, if everything personal is political, does true privacy even exist anymore?